So the next aspect, and the last two components of the presentation will be much quicker. The next aspect is why computer network technologies are different from other kinds of technologies. The first you've probably read about in at least the Joe Nye reading for today, and may know about it from the rest of the world. There's a very famous cartoon, Nobody on the Internet Knows You're a Dog. The basic logic of this is it's extremely difficult to know with precision who is doing things against you using software and computer networks. For a lot of reasons that I can go into more in Q&A if you're interested, but otherwise just take my word for it that it's really, really hard to do confident attribution in the sense of knowing whether or not an adversary is a government versus a criminal gang backed by a mafia or something else. And determining that is really important for policy because knowing whether, let's say, it's the Chinese military versus some criminal group in China matters a huge amount in terms of your policy response and whether or not you're going to threaten retaliation. Another is the importance of the private sector in all of this. And this is a recurrent theme. The technologies, all these devices that allow for new types of coercion, even ones that are military systems, are developed by companies. Governments are stepping in to try to provide for a public good, which is cybersecurity, improved cybersecurity for everyone, but we're all working for companies and using commercial technologies that are vulnerable and that can make us vulnerable to foreign coercion. And so this complicates things tremendously. It's not the same as an insurgency conflict overseas. It's right here at home and it's all around us. And it requires partnerships with entities that, as I mentioned, are not necessarily incentivized to focus on security. So if I'm a company and I'm rolling out a new product, I know for sure that slowing the product rollout to improve security is going to cost me money. If I ship an insecure product, someone may or may not find that vulnerability, and even if they do, I might continue to sell that product. People might still buy it. And so if you're making that choice, you're always going to default to ship the product first, even if it's not a very secure product. This is a really consistent logic that applies to the private sector and that confounds government policy to deal with cybersecurity. Okay, the next is the diffusion of weapons and capabilities, and Joe Nye wrote about this in the piece that you read. It's cheap to develop these kinds of exploits. A state cyber capability at scale is going to be more expensive, but it's way less expensive than other military technologies. Pretty much all of the examples that I've given you today were developed by very small groups of people, 10 or fewer. These are mostly security researchers at universities who focus on computer network security. And so if you are developing these kinds of exploits all the time, and we know about these because they're being reported, people want to show off that they've developed them. But if you don't know that they're happening and all you're doing is storing all of these, and by the way, this is a policy problem in the United States too, not just a global one. We don't really know what NSA is doing in terms of developing exploits and when it's using them. We know a little bit more this year, but we still don't have a really good sense of what the rate is of development. This means that you constantly have in reserve the ability to cause these types of coercive effects and do intelligence collection, and it's relatively cheap to develop. And I'm going to talk about this more in a couple of examples. And the last one is scale. And this is something that I referred to earlier, which is the distributed nature of IT and the large volumes of people using particular devices that are vulnerable gives you effects at scale that are just unparalleled other than WMD, and WMD requires always some kind of state, almost always, I guess I shouldn't forget Shinrikyo, almost always requires state-level infrastructure. And even then, it requires enormous expenditures. Cyber capabilities do not. And this is a trend that is working against security researchers all the time because the cost of computation and data retention is constantly declining. So if you take a look at this graphic, which is not made by me and probably needs to be updated but is good enough for our purposes, when you start thinking about what you can do with really cheap computation and how massive the scale of the internet is, you get attacks like the recent financial sector denial of service attacks in the United States, where you have entire data centers compromised using tens of gigabytes to hundreds of gigabytes per second of volume flow for criminal activity and possibly coercive activity if that was in fact a government. Another aspect of this that is fascinating to think about is you only need a small number of really skilled people working in the cyber domain to create capabilities that allow lots of non-technical or barely technical people to cause cyber effects, including doing cyber attacks. So this includes things like just being able to look up passwords or download brute forcing dictionaries, which is a mechanism for just cycling through lots of passwords to try to break into a network. Criminal malware kits, which you can buy pretty cheaply, which just let you create malware. It lets you create viruses at home pretty cheaply. And it's really hard for antivirus to detect these because each variant, even when one of you pays a few $100 for one of these packages and compiles it, it's going to look a little different from everything that antivirus has seen before. My favorite example of automating techniques for cyber operations is something that just came out in the last couple of years called Shodan. This was actually a kid's project. Shodan is a search engine like Google, but for devices. All this does is find the kinds of things that I've been showing you today in terms of vulnerable devices worldwide. There are over 100 million devices in Shodan. So if I know I have that exploit for a surveillance camera, like I showed you in the first example, I can type in the model number and find all of them in the world that are connected to the internet. And so this is an example of looking just for web servers, something that's benign, but you can use this for industrial control systems and door locks and anything that happens to be connected to the internet. And all the search engine does is automate the process for you. So you can be someone who is not particularly clever, find an exploit, and go and do bad things with it. Now, for most of you, you're going to end up getting caught and arrested. But if you're a government, you don't need to have NSA-level capabilities. You don't need to have Chinese military capabilities, though that matters, and I'll talk about that in just a second. You can be a government that has very little experience with cyber warfare, like Pakistan. And let's say you dedicate just 100 people. 100 people is nothing for a military. To doing nothing but using those automated tools, you develop an enormous amount of capability that you can use for intelligence collection and possibly coercion. And so the last aspect of combining scale and diffusion is thinking in exactly those terms. How many governments now have advanced cyber capabilities, and how many will have advanced cyber capabilities 5, 10, 20 years from now? And what does that mean for international politics? So think about a world in which the kinds of vulnerabilities I've laid out are not just in the hands of security researchers doing a very limited thing, but are part of the routine. So what we've learned about NSA, what you read about in terms of Chinese cyber espionage in the Mandiant report, as a routine part of international politics that everyone is engaged in. So the Deputy Secretary of Defense a few years ago published an article in which he suggested that over 100 countries have some kind of cyber warfare program. It doesn't take that much effort for those cyber warfare programs to do consequential things. Give them 5 years, give them 10 years of developing expertise, and it leads to real capabilities. So this is an opinion because we haven't actually observed it yet. My opinion is the intersection of these trends suggests that cyber conflict is far more likely to be violent and part of any future foreign policy crisis or hostility.